I heard it with my own ears. Why is he even still alive? The laugh that followed wasn't loud, just sharp enough to cut something deep in me. My name is Earl Kowalski. I'm 67 years old, retired electrician, widower, and that sentence spoken by my daughter-in-law Nadine at my son's backyard cookout was the last thing she ever got from me for free. I was standing behind the wooden gate holding my old red toolbox, the steel one with the dented corner I've had since 1987. Neil, my son, had called me 3 days earlier asking if I could come look at a circuit breaker in the guest room. Said it kept tripping. Said he didn't have time to call a contractor out. So I drove 40 minutes across Indianapolis and showed up like I always had. No complaint, no invoice, just me and the tools. I didn't turn around when I heard it. I pushed the gate open and walked into that backyard like I hadn't heard a single word. Past the string lights they'd strung up along the fence, past the folding tables covered in food, past the faces that didn't turn my way. The air smelled like charcoal and citronella candles. Music thumped from a Bluetooth speaker somewhere, too much bass, not enough melody, someone cleared their throat. Oh, Earl, that was Nadine, same voice from behind the fence, now wearing a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "We didn't know you were coming today." Neil asked me to look at the breaker, I said. She nodded too fast and walked away before I could say another word. No offer to take the toolbox. No welcome. No, can I get you something to drink? Just her back moving toward her friends like I was a repair call she'd already forgotten about. I found a folding chair at the far end of the patio and sat down. My back was stiff from the drive, but I sat up straight. I've always sat straight. Dorothy used to say it was the one vanity I allowed myself. Neil came out after a while. He shook my hand the way you shake a stranger's hand at a job site. Firm, quick, no eye contact. "Hey Dad, glad you made it. I'll show you the breaker after we eat." Then he went back to the table where Nadine's family was sitting. Her sister Michelle, her mother, 2 friends I'd seen maybe once before at a birthday party. I watched them laugh about something. Nobody came over. Nobody brought me a plate. My grandson Pete ran through the yard 3 times over the next hour. He glanced at me each time like I was a piece of backyard furniture that had always just been there. A lawn chair, a grill, Grandpa. I used to keep a coffee can in my truck with spare mechanical parts, springs and gears, and small things Pete liked to take apart on the workbench in my garage. I'd been meaning to bring it out for 2 months. I kept forgetting. Or maybe I kept hoping he'd ask. He never asked. After an hour, Neil walked me inside to the breaker panel. It was a loose connection on the 20-amp kitchen circuit. 10 minutes of work. I tightened the terminal, checked the rest of the panel while I was at it. Noted 2 outlets in the kitchen that were showing wear on the contacts. I'd wired those outlets myself 6 years ago, spent a full Saturday on them while Neil and Nadine were at a wedding. They came home to working outlets and a note on the counter that said, "All done, call if anything acts up." Neither of them ever called. When I finished, Neil was already back outside. I let myself out the side door, carried the toolbox to my truck, loaded it in the back and sat behind the wheel for a long moment, looking at the house through the windshield. Brick front, covered porch, the deck I'd built along the back. I knew every nail in that structure. Then I started the engine and drove home. Not in anger, not in grief, just quiet, with something forming in my chest that hadn't been there that morning. The next morning I made coffee in my small stovetop pot. 1 cup, the way I'd done every morning since Dorothy passed 4 years ago. I sat at the kitchen table by the window, same spot I'd sat in for 31 years. The maple out front was losing its leaves early. October always moved faster than I wanted it to. I didn't call anyone that Sunday, didn't turn on the TV. After the coffee, I went to the garage and sat on the stool at my workbench. I do that sometimes when I need to think. The garage is the one place in the house that hasn't changed much. Same pegboard on the wall, same labeled drawers, same overhead fluorescent that buzzes faintly when it first comes on. Dorothy always called it the tidiest room in the house because I was the only one allowed to make a mess in it. I sat there and thought about the house Neil and Nadine lived in, not out of bitterness, out of the plain need to see the facts clearly. When they were looking to buy 9 years ago, they were short on the down payment. Neil called me on a Tuesday night. I didn't ask a lot of questions. I wrote a check for $40,000 from the account Dorothy and I had been building for 30 years. Just to help you get started, I told him, no strings attached, no repayment expected, because that's what you do for your kid. 3 years later, the roof started going. I spent 2 weekends up there with my brother-in-law Len, tearing off the old shingles and laying new ones. We worked in the August heat without complaining. Cost me about $4,200 in materials. Len did it for a case of beer and my word that I'd help him with his gutters in the fall. The electrical panel needed upgrading the year after that. I pulled the permits myself, did all the work over a long weekend, saved them somewhere around $300 to $800 in contractor fees. The deck off the back was rotting the following spring. I designed it, bought the lumber, and built the whole thing in 3 days while Neil was at a work conference in Columbus. I'd kept every receipt, every permit application, every materials invoice, not because I ever planned to ask for anything back, because that's what a tradesman does. You document the work. You keep the records. It's not suspicion. It's just how you're trained. The folder in my filing cabinet was labeled Neil House. I hadn't opened it in years. That evening I pulled it out, sat at the kitchen table under the kitchen light, and spread it across the table. The check stub, the permit applications with my name on the contractor line, the lumber receipts, the roofing materials invoice, a rough log I'd kept of hours worked, which I'd never tallied up until that night. I added it up. Materials plus labor at standard Indianapolis electrician and contractor rates, $62,000, give or take. I looked at that number for a while. Then I looked at the gift letter I'd written when I handed over the down payment check. Because you're my son, I had written at the bottom. Just that. No conditions. No expectations. It hurt to read that line more than I expected. That evening I called Sylvia Hartman. We'd met years ago through Dorothy's book club. She was sharp, practical, and had spent 20 years in probate law before moving into estate and trust work. We weren't close friends, but we'd stayed in contact. I told her I had questions about property, gifts, and documents. She didn't ask why. She just said, "Come by tomorrow, bring everything." I slept well that night. Sylvia's office was on the second floor of a building downtown, quiet the way offices get when the work inside them is serious. Her desk had neat stacks of folders, a coffee mug, and a glass jar of peppermints that looked like nobody ever touched them. She skimmed the documents I brought, gave a short nod, and sat back. "The $40,000 is gone," she said. "You gifted it, no written conditions, no shared title. It's theirs." "I know," I said. "That's not why I'm here." She looked up from the folder. "I want to know what I can still control," she told me. "Wills, powers of attorney, beneficiary designations, bank accounts, trusts." She laid it out plain, the way good professionals do when they can see you're not there to be coddled. "You can't take the house back," she said, "but you can make sure nothing else follows it." That was enough. She gave me a handwritten checklist on a yellow notepad sheet. I folded it and put it in my shirt pocket. When I walked out of her office, the air outside felt sharper than when I'd gone in, cleaner somehow. That evening, I sat at the kitchen table with a blank sheet of paper and wrote one name at the top, Neil. Then I drew a single line through it, not out of hatred, not even out of anger, out of the same feeling you get when you finally fix a wiring problem you've been ignoring for too long. Relief. Clarity. The job should have been done sooner. I spent the next few days going through the house slowly, not packing, just looking. I walked through each room with a notepad the way I used to walk a job site before starting work. You assess before you act. That was drilled into me in trade school, and I never lost the habit. In the hallway, there was a shelf where I kept framed photos. Neil at his high school graduation. Neil and Nadine at their wedding. Pete at maybe 6 years old sitting on my workbench, holding a wrench twice the size of his hand. I stood in front of that last one for a while. Dorothy had taken that photo. She'd laughed so hard she nearly dropped the camera. I left the photos where they were for now. In the back of my filing cabinet behind the house folder, I found the power of attorney Neil had signed 3 years ago. I'd had a health scare, nothing serious in the end, but the doctors recommended I designate someone for medical and financial decisions just in case. Neil had signed the paperwork without hesitation, told me it was no problem, and never mentioned it again. Never called afterward to ask how the follow-up appointments went, never once checked in. I held that document for a long time sitting at the kitchen table in the quiet, then I called Sylvia and told her I was ready to move. Second visit to her office. She had the revocation form printed before I sat down. "Power of attorney first," I said. "You're sure?" She looked at me over her glasses. "It's a significant shift." "I'm sure." She slid the form across the desk. I signed it in steady strokes. She notarized it, stapled the copy neatly, and set it aside. "The will," I said. "What do you want to change?" "Remove Neil as executor. Remove him completely." She paused at that. "You want to cut him out entirely." "He has a house, a job, a family," I said. "He has what I gave him. He doesn't need what I've saved on top of it. He's already made clear what he values." She didn't push back, just opened a template and started typing. "Who takes his place as executor?" "A professional," I said. "Someone who doesn't look through me like I'm a loose end to be dealt with eventually." She made a note. "And your estate, the house? Set it up in a living trust. I stay the trustee while I'm alive. When I'm gone, the house gets sold. All of it liquidated." Where do the proceeds go? I reached into my jacket and put a worn brochure on her desk. Greenfield Community College Apprenticeship Trades Program. Dorothy and I had sponsored a student through it every few years, back when we had enough to give, a kid who wanted to learn electrical or plumbing or carpentry, but couldn't afford the first year's fees. We never told anyone about it. It wasn't that kind of giving. That program, I said, all of it goes there. Sylvia was quiet for a moment. She looked at the brochure, then at me. You're very clear about all of this, she said. I've been unclear long enough, I said. I signed everything that afternoon. She notarized each page, stacked the copies into a slim binder, and handed it across the desk. If you change your mind about any of it, she said. Walking me to the door, just call. I won't, I said. Outside the sky was gray and flat. I walked to my truck slowly, not in a hurry. Some days you carry your own weather, and that was one of them, but it was my weather, nobody else's. That evening I got home to a blinking voicemail light, 2 messages. First one was Neil. Hey Dad, Nadine says you seemed off at the party. Not sure what's going on. Give me a call when you get a chance. Second was Nadine cooler, shorter. Earl, we're not sure what's happening, but Neil says you've been talking to lawyers. If there's some kind of issue, you can just talk to us directly. I stood at the machine and listened to both of them twice. Then I deleted them both and went to the garage. The next morning I called a locksmith. Young guy, polite, no questions asked. He replaced the front door lock and the back door deadbolt in under an hour. When he handed me the new keys, I made 4 copies. 1 in my wallet. 1 in the fireproof box in the bedroom closet. 1 with Clint next door, who'd been my neighbor for 22 years and knew how to keep his mouth shut. 1 in my safe deposit box at the bank. I slept better that night than I had in months. No restlessness. No lying awake running the same thoughts in circles. Just rest. Saturday morning, I drove to First Mutual Credit Union on Keystone Avenue. The branch was quieter than I remembered. No long lines, just the low hum of printers and a couple of tellers talking behind the counter. I asked for the branch manager. A woman named Diane Pruitt came out from a side office, mid-40s, brisk but not unfriendly. She led me to her glass-walled office and offered coffee. I declined. I want to review all authorized users on my accounts, I said. She pulled up the screen, scrolled for a moment. You have 1 cosigner and 1 authorized cardholder listed. Neil Kowalski, that your son used to be, I said. She looked up from the screen. Would you like to remove him? I'd like to remove him completely. Cancel his card, remove cosigner status, issue new account numbers, change the online login, set new security questions, and lock the account. So it requires my in-person visit for any future changes. Her fingers paused above the keyboard. All of that today? All of that today? She nodded and started typing without another word. I appreciated that. She didn't ask me why. Didn't give me the look some people give you when you do something they find surprising. Just did the job. While she worked, I looked at the small plant on the corner of her desk. A little succulent in a clay pot. Dorothy had one just like it on her kitchen windowsill for years. Said it was the only living thing in the house that didn't need anything from her. She watered it once a week and it just kept going. Diane slid the paperwork across to me. All updated. If you'd like to set up a trust account or review beneficiary designations on any savings products, we can help with that too. I'll be back for that, I said. I'm still building the next version of things. She smiled like she understood more than she said. Walking out of that bank, I didn't feel like a man who had won something. I felt clean. The way you feel after you finally fixed a problem that's been sitting in the wall for years, behind the drywall where nobody could see it, tripping breakers in the middle of the night. Neil showed up at the house that Wednesday evening. I heard his truck before I saw it. The engine idled out front for a long time before he finally got out. I didn't open the door. He knocked once, then again, then stood on the porch for a moment. Then he called through the door. Dad, I know you changed the locks. I'm not here to fight. I just want to understand what's happening. I sat on the couch with my hands on my knees. Whatever it is, we can talk it through. That's all I'm asking. He sounded less angry than lost, like a man who'd been following a map for years and just realized the map was wrong, but couldn't figure out where he'd taken the wrong turn. You changed the locks, you blocked my number. I don't even know what I did. That last sentence sat in the air. I didn't answer it. After a while, I heard his boots on the porch steps, then the truck door, then the engine pulling away. I watched him from the window as he backed out slow and drove down the street. Then I went to the kitchen and made a sandwich, ate it at the table without the TV on. My father used to say that some conversations happen whether you open your mouth or not. Silence has its own message. I was starting to count on that. Nadine came on a Friday morning, 10 days after Neil's visit. She knocked the way people knock when they're trying to sound calm, but aren't quite managing it. 3 sharp raps, then a pause, then one more. I opened the front door but left the screen door latched. Nadine Earl. She was dressed for work, heels too polished for the weather, coat buttoned all the way up. Her expression was the one she used when she wanted to look reasonable. I'd seen it at Thanksgiving tables and parent-teacher nights. It never quite fit her face. "This has gone far enough," she said. "You've blocked Neil, you've changed your accounts, you're moving money around with lawyers. We are your family." "Yes," I said. "Then act like it." She shifted her weight. "Whatever I said at the party, I didn't mean anything by it. People say things. You know how those afternoons get?" "I know exactly what was meant," I said. "And so do you?" Her jaw tightened. "You're punishing Neil for something I said. That's not fair to him." "I'm not punishing anyone," I said. "I'm adjusting what I leave behind." She looked past me into the hallway, the way people do when they're looking for something familiar to hold on to. Maybe she expected to see Neil's school photo still on the shelf, or the coat rack that had been there since he was a kid. The hallway was clean. "You put $40,000 into that house," she said, her voice dropping slightly. "You want to throw away the relationship over one afternoon?" "The afternoon wasn't the relationship," I said. "The afternoon was just the day I finally saw it clearly. 9 years of showing up. 9 years of fixing what needed fixing, building what needed building, writing checks when you were short. And the whole time I was furniture, useful furniture, but still just furniture." She opened her mouth and closed it again. "I have $62,000 worth of receipts in a folder in my filing cabinet," I said, "not because I ever planned to ask for anything back, but they're there. And they tell a story about what I thought this family was and what it actually was." "That's not fair," she said. "Maybe not," I said, "but it's accurate." She stood there a moment longer, then she picked up her purse and turned toward the steps. "Don't expect us to come running when you change your mind," she said, without turning around. "I won't change it," I said. The screen door stayed latched. I watched her walk down the front path and get into her car without looking back. I stood in the kitchen for a while after, not feeling triumphant, not feeling much of anything loud, just a settled kind of quiet, the same feeling you get when you finish a job, put your tools away, and lock up the truck. Then I went out to the garage and organized the top drawer of my toolbox, every small part back in its labeled compartment, not because it needed it, because I needed to do something with my hands. Pete texted me on a Thursday afternoon, out of nowhere. "Hey, Grandpa, can I come over?" I stared at the screen for a moment. He hadn't reached out to me on his own in over a year. I typed back 2 words. "Come ahead." He showed up an hour later on his bicycle, the old Schwinn with the bent derailleur he'd been complaining about since last summer. He leaned it against the garage door and came inside with his hands stuffed in his hoodie pocket. Sneakers untied, the way 16-year-olds always look like they just rolled out of somewhere. "Mom's pretty mad at you," he said, standing in the kitchen doorway. I figured. I said, "Dad's not mad. He's just quiet." "That's usually worse," I said. He looked around the kitchen, like he was checking whether things had changed. They hadn't much. Same table, same window, same coffee pot on the same counter. I made him a ham sandwich, and we sat across from each other. He ate with both hands the way he used to when he was 8 years old. Some things don't change. "Can I see the garage?" he asked when the sandwich was gone. We went out there together. I watched him take it in. The pegboard wall, the labeled drawers, the overhead light that buzzes when it first comes on. He'd been in that garage 100 times, but he always looked at it the same way, like he was reading something written in a language he was still learning. Then he spotted his bicycle through the side window leaning against the exterior wall. "The derailleur's been off for months," he said. "I know," I said. "You mentioned it at Easter." He looked at me. "You remembered that." I pulled the stool out from under the bench and nodded toward it. He sat down. I went to the third drawer on the left and got the cable tension tool and a pair of needle-nose pliers. Then I walked outside, rolled the bike in, and flipped it upside down on the bench mat. "Come here," I said. I showed him where the cable had stretched, why the rear derailleur was skipping between the middle gears, what needed adjusting, and in what order. He watched close. Didn't pretend to understand things he didn't. Asked one good question about why the barrel adjuster worked the direction it did. I gave him the tool and let him make the correction himself. His hands were steadier than I expected. He turned the adjuster a quarter click, tested the shift with his thumb on the lever, turned it another quarter. The chain moved clean across the cassette. He looked up at me with an expression I recognized, the same one Neil used to have at that age when something he'd built or fixed actually worked, before the years taught him to keep his face neutral. "That's it," Pete said. "That's it." I said. He stayed until dark. We didn't talk about Neil or Nadine. We talked about a small engine repair class his school was offering next semester, whether it was worth taking, We talked about a carburetor rebuild I'd done on Dorothy's old lawnmower engine years ago and kept on a shelf as a display piece. He asked if he could take it apart to see how it worked. I told him it was his if he put it back together when he was done. He wrapped it carefully in an old shop rag and put it in his backpack. When he left, he said he'd come back next weekend. I told him the garage would be open. After his bike disappeared around the corner, I stood in the garage doorway for a while, just listening to the neighborhood settle into evening. Somewhere 2 houses down, a dog was barking at something. A car turned onto the street, slowed, turned again. I went back inside and sat at the kitchen table. Dorothy kept a small journal, nothing fancy, just one of those cloth-covered notebooks from the drugstore. She wrote in it most evenings, a few lines, sometimes just a sentence. After she passed, I read through the ones from her last few years. Most of it was small things. Weather, what she cooked, a funny thing she heard on the radio, but every few pages there'd be a line about Pete, about how he reminded her of me at that age, how he had the same hands. I hadn't thought about that in a while. I pulled out a notepad from the kitchen drawer and wrote one sentence in the middle of the page. He came back on his own. Then I folded it and put it in the drawer with her letters. 2 weeks later, Harold Fenwick called. He was the real estate attorney Sylvia had recommended for the trust and property side of things. I'd met with him once the week before, brought the deed, the property tax records, the full folder of repair invoices going back to when I'd had the furnace replaced in 2009. He'd looked through everything quietly, asked a few precise questions, and told me he'd have the documents ready within the week. Everything's in order, he said on the phone. The living trust is active, your name only. The property transfers into it today. When you're ready to sell, I handle it. The proceeds go directly to the Greenfield program per the trust terms. No family involvement, no exceptions. Good, I said. I'll messenger the final binder to you this afternoon. I thanked him and set the phone down on the table. Outside the kitchen window, the maple was bare now. All the leaves down. The branches looked cleaner without them, more honest about what they were. I poured a second cup of coffee, something I almost never did, and sat with it while the afternoon light moved across the floor. The binder arrived at 4. I read through it at the table, every page, every clause, my name on each one, my terms, no weak spots. No room for someone to come back later and say they didn't understand. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like a man waiting on something. I felt like a man who had handled his business. The house sold 3 weeks later. Harold handled the walkthrough and the closing. I signed what needed signing and let it go. He called when it closed, gave me the final number, and I thanked him and hung up. That same afternoon, I drove to Greenfield Community College, parked in the visitor lot, walked into the trades building, and asked for the director of the apprenticeship program. A younger guy named Gary came out, maybe 32, wearing a polo shirt with the school logo on it. I told him I had a donation and slid the check across his desk. He looked at it for a long moment. Then he looked up at me. "This is from a trust," he said. "That's right." I said, "Is there anything you want us to do with it?" "Name a room, set up a scholarship fund with conditions." "No conditions," I said. "Use it for kids who want to learn a trade and need a hand getting started. That's all." He shook my hand with both of his. I drove home and made dinner and ate it standing at the stove the way I'd done most nights since Dorothy passed. Leeks and potatoes, something she used to make on cold evenings. The apartment smelled right for the first time in a while. A letter came on a Tuesday. Handwritten envelope, Neil's return address in the corner. I opened it at the kitchen table. "Dad, I don't know how to fix what happened. Maybe I can't. I said things I shouldn't have said, and I let things go on that I should have stopped a long time ago. I'm not writing to ask for anything back. I just want you to know I'm sorry. Pete talks about you every day now. He's different this fall than he was last year. More focused, more himself. I think that came from you. I hope one day you'll let me try again." I read it twice, folded it carefully along the original creases, put it in the drawer in the hallway, the one where I kept Dorothy's letters and the notepad page I'd written Pete's name on. Not forgiveness, not a door slammed shut either, just a space where it could rest until I knew what to do with it. Pete came back the following Saturday, same as he'd promised. He had the carburetor with him, fully reassembled, wrapped back in the shop rag. He set it on the bench and I checked his work. Every component in the right place, every screw seated clean. "You do this yourself?" I said. "Looked up a diagram online," he said. "Took me 3 tries on the needle valve. I put it back on the shelf where it had always sat. Then I reached under the bench and pulled out the coffee can I'd been meaning to bring over to his house for 2 months. Springs, gears, a broken compass, a small ratchet mechanism from an old clock. I set it on the bench in front of him. He looked at it the way Dorothy used to look at a new book, like he was already deciding where to start. We worked side by side for 2 hours. He didn't ask about his parents. I didn't offer anything about them. Some things don't need to be talked about to be understood. When he left that afternoon, he said the same thing he'd said the week before. Same time next Saturday, garage will be open, I said. I watched him ride down the street until he turned the corner. Then I went back inside and sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and the quiet that had stopped feeling empty and started feeling like something I'd earned. The tools were on the wall where they always were. The drawer was labeled the way it had always been. The house was the same house it had been for 31 years. But the weight I'd been carrying in, it was gone. Not because anything dramatic had happened, just because I'd finally done the maintenance I'd put off too long. Dorothy used to say I'd fix everything in the house except the things that actually needed fixing. She wasn't wrong, but I was learning. If any of this sounds familiar to you, then you already know what I'm talking about. You've shown up, you've done the work. You've written the checks and kept your mouth shut and told yourself that's just what fathers do. And maybe somewhere along the way, the people you built things for stopped seeing the man and started seeing the resource. That's not weakness. That's what happens when good men stay quiet too long. But here's what I learned. The same hands that built the thing can change the documents. The same man who gave too much can decide what he gives from here on out. You don't need a confrontation. You don't need a speech. You just need a folder, a good attorney, and the willingness to finally put your own name at the top of the page. It's not too late. It's never too late to handle your business.